You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David DeBatto. Today, my very special guest is Timothy Ash. Tim is an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Chatham House in UK. He's also a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Jay Asset Management in London. Tim's worked as a professional economist for over 30 years. 20 years of which was in the banking industry, working for such institutions as RBS, Bear Stearns Nomura, ICBC Standard Bank, among others. Tim specializes in emerging European economics as related to fixed income investments. He writes and blogs extensively on economic challenges, and his work can be seen in the Kyiv Post, the Atlantic Council, the Financial Times, United Business Journal, and others. Tim's advised various governments on Ukraine-Russia policy and specifically on the impact of sanctions. It's with great pleasure that I welcome back to the No Delusion Zone, Tim Ash. Welcome back, Tim.
My pleasure. Great to be here again.
Well, as we said a little bit off air, it is an interesting time. There's certainly enough news flying around the world, especially the Western world. And I want to kick it off right away with a new piece that at least new to me that I just read that was originally published, I believe, in the Financial Times. And that is a new European Union proposal for a peace negotiation, actually forcing a peace negotiation by accepting more natural gas, resuming the gas pipeline from Russia that has been substantially cut since the full-scale invasion in February of 2022, but now some, not all, some EU leaders are suggesting that they renegotiate that, reopen it, and take some more of that good old Russian natural gas to try to force both sides to the negotiating table. What are your thoughts?
Well, at first glance, you think, how extraordinary. Are European politicians that stupid? I mean, let's just go back 3 years, 3.5 years, right? And, mid-21, the build up to the full-scale invasion, Europe almost completely dependent on energy supplies one way or another from Russia. And Putin basically turning the taps down, pretending that various turbines for gas were in need of renovation, and energy prices rising as a result. And Putin at that point had big leverage over Europe, which is exactly what he wanted, right? He wanted to be in a position to force an energy crisis in Europe, to get Europe on its knees, get the European economy on its knees, to then impose conditions on Ukraine. That was clear cut, right? We survived a couple of difficult winters, gleaning ourselves off that dependency on Russian energy, and there's light at the end of the tunnel. We are more diversified. There's been accelerated climate transition, all those kind of things. And then you read this story and it's like, where have these guys been for 3.5 years, right? Now, that was my initial take. And then I thought a little bit about it, perhaps. And you hope there's a bit more going on behind the scenes here. Now remember, just a week ago, Putin's friends in Europe, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Robert Fico in Slovakia, they were playing really hardball on the 6-month renegotiation or reaffirmation of European sanctions on Russia, right? They were threatening to veto those, block them, unless the issue of gas transit was put back on the agenda. And seemingly there was an agreement that would be done. It's possible that what we see today is part of that agreement. And actually, Orban and Fico did sign off on the renewal of sanctions, right? So that was a positive. Now, I would think maybe behind the scenes, there's some game playing by someone in Brussels or players in Brussels. And this is the thinking. The thinking is that if you're Donald Trump and you're sat in the US and you're looking at this story, you're thinking to yourself, Europe is still dependent on the US. It's writing checks for European security. What the hell are these Europeans doing, going and gifting new business to Putin in Russia? And maybe the Europeans are hoping that Trump reacts very aggressively, warning Europe not to do that, threatening tariffs perhaps on Europe to do this. And actually, in the end, making sure that Orban and Fico don't get what they want, right? In a way, Trump delivers, hopefully, for Europe, a veto on a resumption of gas transit and gas supply from Russia to Europe, right? I mean, I would hope that's going on in the background. I can't imagine a US administration would be comfortable with Europe going back to reliance on Russian energy, especially, obviously, when the US is very eager to sell US LNG into Europe. So I think that will be Trump's focus. He won't be very happy about it. I'm sure we're going to see some tweets very shortly about it. And I mean, the irony really is, if you think about it, is Viktor Orban in Hungary seems to have a pretty good relationship with Trump. But maybe this would cause a bit of a breaking point in terms of that relationship. And actually, Orban, interestingly, and Fico in Slovakia, they have problems at home at the moment. Their economies are not performing particularly well. Europe has this growth problem. Their development model's been based on foreign direct investment into the auto sectors and an export-driven growth. A lot of that has been investment from the Chinese. So maybe that's going to grate with the Trump administration, and maybe we'll see maybe a not as rosy relationship between Viktor Orban and Trump as perhaps people thought would be the case. So anyway, look, the headline was horrible. I'm hopeful. I cannot imagine, in reality, I just cannot imagine the reality that this is going to happen, right? It would be ludicrous if this actually happened.
Wow. You know, I hope, Tim, that you're correct in terms of giving these few European leaders the benefit of the doubt that they're actually doing something behind the scenes. And they may be. I have to say, though, I haven't been all that impressed with a lot of the leaders of the EU and NATO in the last 3 or 4 years at all. I think I've made that very clear in everything I've ever written or said. But having said that, I hope that you're correct. You know far more about the economics of it and what may be going on behind the scenes in terms of leverage and negotiation than I do. So I hope you're correct. And you mentioned Slovakia. They're actually having real problems. I mean, there's massive demonstrations in the street right now against Fico because of his government, and not just because of his visit to Moscow, which they don't like, but economics. Their country's not doing very well right now. So, yeah, I mean, all of this could play into it. The Trump card, like you said, not to make a pun, I think is very good. What do you think the chances, though, Tim, are that this ploy by the EU, some of the EU, is to force Zelensky into making a deal?
I don't think so. I mean, Ukraine is not dependent on Russian gas anymore. It has diversified. The gas transit fees were pretty small for Ukraine anyway.
But it would feed the Russian military by increasing their revenue if the EU, Europe starts to buy more natural gas again from Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this business, Russian gas supply to Europe was a 50 billion euro a year business, right? Which has more or less collapsed because of the war and sanctions, etc. And the difficulty with Russia with this gas is, it's not that easy. It's not like crude oil, where you just ship it on a tanker. Gas, you need to build pipelines, right? So if they're thinking of extracting it in Western Europe or the west of Russia and selling it to the Chinese, they need to be built pipelines, right? The Chinese don't really want to finance those. That's been the message. So the Russians are stuck. I mean, they've lost this business. Gazprom, their once mighty gas major, is struggling at the moment, right, because of the loss of these markets. So yes, if Europe gifted Putin a resumption of this trade, it would help resurrect Gazprom. It would help resurrect the Russian economy, and it would help resurrect Russia's rejuvenation of its conventional military capability that has been lost in Ukraine and will continue to be a threat to the Western Europe. So it is madness. It's insanity if Europe does this.
And you don't think they will? I don't think they will either. I think it's a real, I don't know what we would call it, a Hail Mary pass in American football. A last chance, a gasp, a real long shot, if you will. So I don't know if it was a good idea at all. I just hope you're right, that they're not serious about this. I want to talk about a fairly recent article you wrote about the economics of this of the war and rebuilding. And it was called Cash Rich Ukraine is Future-Proofed for Now. And I think it was actually published this month. Talk about that article and what was the main thesis of that?
Yeah, so obviously there's been a lot of focus about how the West funds Ukraine 3 years, almost 3 years into the war. And we had big concerns before the US elections, and given Trump's comments about continuing to fund Ukraine, J.D. Vance also made, pretty strident comments about, cutting supplies of finance to Ukraine. So we were really worried about how Ukraine would sustain itself in a Trump presidency. I mean, to give it credit, the Biden administration, I think, realized the threat, the concern, and it worked with the Europeans to come up with various solutions to pre-finance Ukraine or give them some cash in the bank. So Europe back in, I think, 23 agreed a 4-year, 50 billion euro financing facility, an MFA. A lot of that is still available, undrawn. And then the G7 countries came up with an ERA facility, which is a 50 billion euro facility from the interest stream on immobilized Russian assets, right? So Ukraine has access to a lot of the 50 billion euros, probably like about 40 billion euros left, the 50 billion ERA. They also have about 47 billion in foreign exchange reserves, right? So, and if you think the war has been costing about $100 billion to sustain, the 40 billion from the MFA plus the 50 from the ERA and the reserves, Ukraine is able to fund itself for the next year at least. That's positive. The obvious concern and vulnerability is really in terms of military supplies, right? I mean, Europe, in terms of the overall funding of Ukraine, Europe has been basically providing 60% of the overall funding, 100 billion a year, the US 40%. But in terms of military supplies, equipment, it's been the opposite. It's basically, I think, 60% the Americans, 40% the Europeans. And in the end, Europe just lacks the military industrial capability, right, to fill the gap if the Trump administration decides not to continue to provision weapons to the Ukrainians. I mean, we're banging on about European dysfunction. It is pretty extraordinary. And I think it's something that Trump has been right on, is that, Europe's over-reliance on the US for its security backstop. We're 3 years into this war, 3 years. What has Europe done to build up its own military industrial complex? Where is it building factories to produce shells and missiles and tanks? It's basically sat on its backside and done nothing, right? So they don't seem to be in a much better position than they were in 2021 in terms of supplying military equipment for their own defense and for Ukraine. So unfortunately, Ukraine is still dependent in the end on the US supply of military equipment. Now, they've got the money, they could buy it, and the Europeans could also help them to pitch up to the US and say, hey, Mr. President Trump, here's $100 billion. We would like to buy a full array of US military equipment to help you erode Russia's military capability. I would hope that Trump would not say no to that. I mean, it would be a huge job creator in the US. Putin, Freudian slip. Trump seems to be all about jobs, etc. So I would hope that the US would still sell weapons to Ukraine and Europe for their defense.
You and I have talked before about and you just mentioned it again, I don't know what to call it really. I was going to call it dangerous, insulting. I don't know what the words are for Europe sitting on its hands for the last 3 years. I called it cowardice, incompetence. I'm not sure what it is, Tim, to be honest with you. I know the leaders in Europe recognize the danger, the threat to Europe. from Russian aggression should they prevail in Ukraine. I know they know that. You mentioned that they're no better off than they were 3 years ago. I would argue that it's worse, actually, because as you know, the AfD, the far right in Germany, is poised to win a lot of the seats in the upcoming election in just a few weeks. Olaf Scholz is gone, and he's gone. And whoever takes over is going to be far more hardcore and anti-Ukraine than the current German government, which has had its problems. The same thing's happening all over Europe. I mean, we've got far-right people being elected in, of all places, the Netherlands and Sweden, of course, in France with Le Pen. I think the situation is worse. Not too long ago, I think it was Pistorius, the head of the German Ministry of Defense, said that if it came to a full-scale war with Russia, that the Bundeswehr would run out of ammunition in about 3 weeks. And that's now. That was a few months ago, but still. I don't know what's going on there. I don't want to dwell on this, but in one word or less, why the hell is that the current status in Europe?
Well, I mean, it's a lack of leadership, lack of coordination. I mean, a generalized lack of leadership across Europe, right? A lack of understanding and appreciation, really, of the Russia threat. I mean, that's been a decade-long problem. You could argue it's infiltration by Russia of Western Europe, well, European business and political elites, particularly in Germany, right? It's all the problems that got us where we are. And I think in particular in Germany, that problem's not really been resolved, right? And Germany obviously is the driving force for Europe, right? It's always assuming, it's the free rider problem. Again, Trump got that one certainly right. It's assuming someone else will resolve the problem. It's hoping for the best, assuming and not planning for the worst, right? It's assuming the Ukrainians will not fail. That if you're Germany, that Poland, if Ukraine fails, Poland will fight to, it's a lack of unity, lack of leadership.
But do you think the leaders in Germany and France and the Netherlands and all the rest of them, aside from the Baltics and Poland, are that stupid? I mean, they're pretty smart people. They're not stupid people. But when it comes to that issue of Russian aggression and how vulnerable they are, do you really think they're that naive, or they're cowardly, or what I have suspected and written about, that there are deep, deep financial interests in, especially Germany, in Russia? And that goes all the way to the top, including most of the CEOs and the big businesses, and they still don't want to cut those ties with Russia.
I think you're significantly right there. I mean, I think we have failed to recognize the level of Russian infiltration and corruption of our business and political elites across Europe, right? And they infiltrated business, politics, media, sports, culture. We've recognized that in the UK, and it's encouraging here that across the political spectrum and certainly there's overwhelming popular support in the UK for Ukraine, and that's not wavered at all. I mean, the problem in the UK and a lot of places in Europe is, we also have the cost of living crisis, right? And it's our politicians have failed to explain to their electorates the importance of security, well, the threat from Russia, the importance of security, the importance of increasing defense spending. They just haven't had that conversation, right? And it's pretty extraordinary. I think if you explained to electorates the threat, the scale of the threat, right? I think they would get it, and they would buy into it. But we failed to do that, right? I mean, we failed to have the right kind of conversation with our own populations. The US may view China as the number one existential threat, particularly to its position as global hegemon. In Europe, it's not China, right? In Europe, our number one existential threat is Russia. And, and again, that's quite extraordinary, despite that our leaders have not explained that adequately to our populations and mobilized popular support to better fund and equip our military to push back on Russian expansion in the region.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right, and we've both talked about this, but I've really pounded home the fact that leadership has failed. It's certainly failed us here in the United States. I mean, my God, we've got Donald Trump. The Democrats and all the opposition just failed to communicate the truth. Americans, at least a significant amount of them, 49.9% at least, believed all of the misinformation, all of the lies, a lot of which, much of which, was funded and organized by the Kremlin and given to MAGA. Fact. The same thing in Europe, as you were just mentioning, the infiltration in Europe. Oh my God, especially in Germany, but all over in France, the UK, in the Netherlands and Sweden. I mean, on and on and on. Slovakia. The leaders have failed to articulate what is the real danger. Sure, China is a long-term danger, I believe, to the entire Western world. That's not a secret. But the immediate danger to Western democracies is Russia. Period. End of story. And Western leaders have failed to articulate that. I've said it over and over for a number of reasons: cowardice, incompetence, and greed, corruption. All three of them. They just have not been able to, they refused to level with their population. And Tim, we're going to pay for it. I mean, this ain't over. Russia's not going to go away. And God knows what's going to happen with Ukraine, of course, what kind of a settlement there is. But let's go back to Ukraine for a minute and talk about Trump. The Trump, another article just before the last one you wrote, I think it came out in November, late November, if I'm not mistaken. It's called the Trump Ukraine Victory Fund, a proposal. We talked about that a little. Why hasn't Europe still released the $300 billion in seized assets, most of which are sitting in a bank in Belgium?
Yeah, look, it is extraordinary, right? And it's the same kind of corruption, vested interests that you've already mentioned, right? I mean, there's inertia. I get if you think of Western treasuries, French Treasury, Belgian Treasury, even Her Majesty's Treasury in the UK, they don't like doing things that are difficult or outside the box, and which perhaps have, perhaps there are risks in terms of unintended consequence of it. I get all that, right? But as I argued, if you're not willing to use those frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine, then you either Western taxpayers do it or it doesn't get funded, right? Why should Western taxpayers pay to fund Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression? Why don't Russian taxpayers pay? And in the end, the extraordinary thing is, the frozen Russian assets it's the money of the Russian taxpayer, right? So I just can't get my head around this idea that the Italian government, the Belgian government, the French government, the German government, they think it's better to tap their own taxpayer to pay for Ukraine's defense and recovery and reconstruction than the Russian taxpayer. They're putting the Russian taxpayer ahead of their own. And then they wonder why they're losing elections and they're not very popular, right? Just do something that is rational, logical, right? And I mean, I think on obviously the relationship with Trump is a challenging one for Europe. I mean, how better to go to Trump, free the immobilized Russian assets, go to Trump with as I said, a victory plan or whatever you want to call it for Ukraine and Europe, or a security plan for Europe that pledges to spend a large proportion of that money in the US on weapons, right? How could Trump say no to that, right? And as I mentioned before, the key question mark is really about the assurance that the US will continue to provide military supplies, military equipment to Ukraine and Europe. That will determine whether Ukraine wins or loses this war ultimately, right? And the access and use of that $300 billion, I think, could be pretty instrumental in the decision by Trump, which way he goes on this one.
Well, and getting back to the fact that our leaders, the Western leaders, including the Republicans here in America, have not articulated why we are supporting Ukraine. We've discussed it before. I've discussed it before about how, not infinitesimal, but how relatively small the percentage of the American defense budget has been to go into the defense of Ukraine. You mentioned it just now. If we allowed Ukraine, who would willingly buy weapons from the United States. How many more jobs would be created here in the United States? How many more factories that are either sitting idle or underperforming right now would be at full speed, would hire 3 shifts like they did during past times? This is a net gain for the United States. That has not been articulated by the Republican Party. Why? They're anti-Ukraine. I'm sorry, they love Putin. They really do. At least a lot within MAGA do. And they've passed along that love of all things Kremlin to the MAGA, to the Republican voters. It's a really hard sell right now here, Tim, to turn that ship around, to right it. And say now we're going to support Ukraine. Russia bad, Putin bad. We now have to put more money into it. We're going to try to convince Ukraine to buy weapons from the United States. They should say that, but I don't know if they will. What do you think? Because my head's still spinning from the first 11 days of the Trump administration. What do you think Trump is going to do with Ukraine in the next? Now it's up to 100 days to settle this war. What do you think ultimately is going to happen? What is he going to do, and how long is it going to take?
Well, look, I wrote a few pieces around it. I mean, Trump's in a strong position, right? He has a strong negotiating position. I don't think a long war suits Putin. The Russian economy is in a difficult position at the moment, becoming increasingly difficult. Sanctions are hurting. The casualty toll is pretty enormous. Remember, 3 years into the war, Russia has only captured 20% of Ukrainian territory, and a lot of that was already held after the annexation of Crimea and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014-15, right? Trump has the ability to increase sanctions on Russia. He has said that. He said he's willing to do that if Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table. He's able to sell more weapons to the Ukrainians that give them a greater ability to inflict more damage on the Russian military. He can tell the Europeans to free the immobilized Russian assets and use those to purchase US weapons if he wants. And in the end, look, a longer war has limited impact on the US. No US boots on the ground, no US troops being killed. Every day that goes by, the conventional military capability of Russia, a threat and competitor to the US, are getting eroded. And meanwhile, the US economy benefits from increased defense spending by Ukraine and its European allies, right? So, there's no pressure on Trump to solve this war particularly, actually. So he has the negotiating power. I just hope he uses it, right? He has the power to force to the negotiating table. I mean, it's quite interesting that I'm kind of thinking more broadly about these things. We have the Greenland scenario, which is extraordinary, right? And, it did make me think here. I mean, what Putin wants a Yalta II, right? He wants to sit down with probably Xi and Trump and carve out the world. What Putin thinks is great powers have spheres of influence. Russia's a great power, should have a sphere of influence. That should be Ukraine. So he'd love to sit down with Trump. Now, in thinking through why Trump has pushed on this Greenland idea, I mean, I'm thinking Trump's probably thinking he's going to have to sit down with Putin in a negotiation. His various people, General Kellogg, who's the chief negotiator for Ukraine or rapporteur for Ukraine, has suggested that Putin, that the front lines will probably be frozen where they are, which means Russia de facto will get what it occupies and controls. I mean, I'm thinking in a way that the Greenland push by Trump is an assumption that, if he goes into negotiations with Putin, it's like, okay, you're getting Donbass, what am I getting? What's the quid pro quo? Why should I do this deal? What are you going to... So it's kind of, and maybe that's the way Trump thinks as well, right? And you could possibly also imagine a scenario where China is invited to the table. And, Putin gets Donbass, Trump gets Greenland, Xi gets Taiwan. I mean, is that how Trump thinks about these things? I mean, the Greenland gig is extraordinary, right? I mean, to pressurize a loyal NATO ally, to give or cede territory to you, by threat, by force, by coercion, it's pretty extraordinary. It definitely weakens the Western alliance, right? It does signal to people like Putin that, you can take territory. If America can do it, if America can take Greenland or take the Panama Canal, why not Putin on Donbass and Xi on Taiwan? I mean, it's pretty extraordinary, but it seems very likely that is Trump's kind of game plan here. So, look, I am very worried about the security of Ukraine and Europe going forward. As I said, Trump has a very strong negotiating hand. I just hope he understands that. I hope he is really the great negotiator, because if this deal doesn't ensure Ukraine's security, Ukraine will collapse, right? Ukraine will lose the war, and a Ukrainian collapse would be a disaster for Ukraine, obviously, but also for European security. Putin will not stop in Ukraine. He will continue. Europe is not prepared to defend itself against future Russian aggression, right? So is that good for America? Is it good for the US that your main allies, the allies that stood by you after 9/11, joined you in the intervention in Afghanistan? Many joined the US also in its intervention in Iraq. Obviously, not a great successful intervention, but still, those allies stood by you, and then those allies are destabilized because of Russian aggression. I'm not sure, if Trump is thinking about, or the Trump and the MAGA guys are thinking about this long-term battle for hegemony with China, I would think you'd need strong allies by your side, right? And this scenario panning out, a Russian victory against Ukraine and a massive destabilization of Europe as a result, I don't think can be particularly good in terms of US long-term interests.
Trump is not a good negotiator. He's a moron. I hate to say that in such official terms, but there's been absolutely no evidence over his entire professional life that he's a good negotiator. He's a thug. He threatens people. He uses attorneys. He uses lawsuits and flat out threats. Well documented. He wants what he wants. He's wanted Greenland, Tim, for a long time. I'm sure you know this. This is nothing new. So he's now in a position where he can get it, he thinks. And his advisors have been telling him also it's a good thing to do for all these reasons, the natural resources, the strategic positioning of it on the Arctic and blah, blah, blah. That's all true. It's nothing Trump thought about. He wants Greenland. If he has to go through Denmark to get it, so what? They're a very small country. What kind of an army do they have? Same thing with Panama. He hates China. So he made up the fact that they are in control of the canal. Yes, they do run some of the docks there, and it's probably too much that they have their hands in the till, but they don't run the Panama Canal. So he's threatening Panama, as you know. He's threatening to annex or invade Mexico. He wants to make Canada the 51st state. Why? Because he can. He's not a good negotiator. I'm sorry. I, as you can guess, I don't like Trump very much. He's a danger to my country. He has destroyed our democracy in 11 days. I don't know if we'll ever recover. So no, he's not a good negotiator. He's a disaster. Let me ask you something else, though. In your sphere, economics, if Trump does a Trump and he does put or allow Ukraine to swing in the wind, basically he throws them under the bus for whatever reason, however it happens, what would the economic impact be to the United States should Putin, and he will, go on to Eastern Europe and beyond? What would the economic impact be to the U.S.? Because that's all Trump and MAGA thinks about.
Well, I mean, Europe will be destabilized. Tens of millions of Ukrainians will move west. It will create centrifugal forces in Europe, far right, far left. I can imagine a situation of country on country conflict, right? A lot of the populations in emerging Europe don't like each other very much. I mean, there's a history of that. I would be really, really worried about, stability and security in Europe. And ultimately, that's bad for growth in Europe. The euro, I think, would collapse in that scenario. And that would be very destabilizing. Ultimately, it would be bad for global growth. and it would be bad for global markets, I would think. The destabilization of, one third of the sort of global economy. I mean, that's the reality, right? That wouldn't be particularly good for US companies in terms of markets, I guess.
Wouldn't that directly affect us, though? When I say us, the Americans, you could just said it affects American companies. Europe, I believe, I don't have this exact stats, but they are, if not the one of our biggest trading partners. We certainly are for them. This would have a huge impact on the cross-Atlantic economic sphere. It would be a dramatic hit, wouldn't it?
Well, less global growth, less trade, less European investment in the US economy, right? I mean, it's not a great scenario for the globe, let alone the US economy. So yeah, I think there would be a backdraft to the US.
And again, this wouldn't happen immediately, but in the event of a new Iron Curtain or a Soviet Union 2.0, where they're in half or most of Europe in several years, isn't China going to move into those markets? Aren't they going? Because Russia's certainly not going to be able to take them over right away, regardless of their military conquest. Isn't Russia now, or China then going to dominate the vacuum that's left and totally dominate the world market, which would make it even worse for American businesses and the American public?
Well, I mean, I think European politicians must be looking at what's going on in the US at the moment. And, it was quite extraordinary, Elon Musk's intervention in European politics, in UK politics, in German politics. And, imagine if you're the national security advisor to the British government, right? And your prime minister asks you, what are the key global national security risks to the UK? I would think it's, China, Russia, and Elon Musk. If there's an FT piece that said, Elon Musk is determined to bring down the Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer. I mean, that's extraordinary that a US citizen with huge financial and social media power, who probably has the ability actually to destabilize the UK. I mean, if he decided to spend $50 billion of his own money shorting sterling, shorting gilts, he could create a financial crisis that could undermine the UK government, right? So, China doesn't really do that. I mean, China is not acting. It's not in China's interest to destabilize governments in Europe. I don't think they have an interest in MAGA style, AfD, Le Pen, those kind of administrations to emerge in Europe. Right?
They want stability. They like world trade. They like it. They want to strengthen the global market.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe if you're a European politician or national security advisor looking at that, it's like what is the value of this strategic relationship in the end with the US, right? Yeah. Maybe the Chinese are a better bet. I mean, it's extraordinary that I am even saying that. I find it's blowing my brain in even thinking about that. But those developments we've seen in recent months, again, the Musk's intervention in UK politics, European politics, are extraordinary. And this person has I think, an official role in the US government, right? I mean,
yes, he's an unofficial head of an unofficial agency. I forget the name of it, the Government Efficiency Agency, basically.
Yeah, no, extraordinary.
Now, as you know, you mentioned UK. He has officially endorsed the AfD in Germany and said they are Germany's future. They're Germany's only future. I don't know why countries like Germany and the UK, but certainly Germany, can't declare him a national security risk. If he was a German citizen, he'd be arrested already. I don't know why he's not under investigation and perhaps not allowed into the country, but that's just me.
Well, I mean, he has immense power as a social media and also his personal wealth. I think they're frightened of him. They don't quite know how to deal with him. They hope he goes away. Perhaps they're hoping that they can exert influence elsewhere in the US government to get him to moderate some of his actions. But, again, if the Financial Times report is correct, I mean, for a US business person to actively try to undermine a UK prime minister is utterly extraordinary, right?
That's a national security risk. And I'm sorry, I know he's the most he's the richest man in the world. I don't think anybody really disputes that. He's got immense power. I get that. But he's not going anywhere. And if they ignore him like they're ignoring the threat from Russia, this is not going to turn out well. It still comes down to cowardice and not taking a leadership role. I'm sorry, it all comes down to that. If you're afraid of Elon Musk because he's rich and he's powerful, you don't deserve to be a leader. Certainly not the leader of a country. That's what you're there for. The security of your country is number one. I may be sounding histrionic, but it's pretty simple stuff to me, but apparently not to them.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I mean, I know you know this. It makes me so angry because I'm losing my country here. Maybe you're about to lose your country because of Elon Musk. I've lost mine. I'm sorry. It's a disaster here. It's not fun. But people like me aren't going away. We just get louder, I guess. Listen, Tim, I think let me give you the last word, and then I think we both have to go. Closing thoughts.
No, I mean, you're like a point. I mean, what happens in the US? The US is the leader of the free world, right? I mean, we can't ignore what happens in the US, right? If democracy is not defended and entrenched, whatever you want to call it, that's a huge threat to global stability, and particularly countries like the UK and European countries. But as you mentioned, I mean, our leaders have not particularly covered themselves in glory, right? They are also responsible for the sad malaise of our systems and societies at the moment, right? I mean, I've never been as worried about the outlook for democracies as now, right? So anyway, a sad note, a worrying note.
I appreciate your candor and your honesty, Tim, because I talk to so many people on and off the air that are just I hate to use the word cowards, but they just don't feel they have the ability right now to say the truth. They're afraid, and I get that. I really, really do. This is a time to be afraid. It's a dark time. I've never experienced it in my life. You're saying you haven't either. Even during World War II, democracies were under attack physically, but most of the populations were behind the government. They were fighting for democracy. Not the case now. It's not the case. And that's the scary thought. And we're going to have to leave it there. Tim Ash, yeah. I really appreciate you coming back on again. It's a challenging time. Perhaps the next time we talk, things will be a little brighter and a little better. At least I hope so. But until then, you take care, stay safe, and stay sane.